today's lesson is actually for anybody that was absent this past week. So this is more of like a catch-up lesson, or you can use it if you need additional help with different types of factoring. So in the warm-up, we're just distributing. So we're taking a to 3a. Oh, don't have my pen. Hold on. Okay, so we're distributing a to 3a, which gets you 3a squared. And then you distribute a to 7, which gives you 7a. Okay. If you distribute the negative 2m, you have to multiply it to everything. Okay. Watch the negative, so you get negative 2m cubed, saying how many m's do you have now, and that had 2 and that had 1. And then you have negative 12m squared plus 2m, because a negative times a positive, or negative times a negative is a positive. The next one's a little trickier because you just have to watch your variables and what the exponents are. So you have 4x to the 5th y minus 8x cubed y squared. Okay. So today we're factoring by the greatest common factor, and the question is, what is actually factoring? Well, factoring is just figuring out what multiplies together to get the answer you had before that. So if I ask you what the factors of 6 are, you would say like 1 and 6 are 2 and 3. Well, those factors multiplied together get you that answer. So now we're just doing it more of an algebraic way and not factoring like you did when you were in elementary school. So here's just like a form or example of how you would have it in the simplest form. So if I do letters, it'd be like AB plus AC. And if I factored out what they have in common, what they have in common is an A, and you're left with B plus C. So if you think of the warm-up, these are what would be the simplest form. And what's to the left over here is the factored form. So we're just undoing what we did in previous lessons. So the one thing that does come into play is the term prime. So if I ask you what the factors of 2 were, you'd tell me it's 1 and 2, and that's because 2 is a prime number. That occasionally happens when we're factoring. So sometimes it's a prime answer, meaning basically the only factor is 1. That's the only thing they have in common. So in that situation, it's prime. Now we'll talk more about this later when we go on to different types of factoring, but today we're just talking about greatest common factor. So what I'm asking you is that what most do they have in common? So number 1, the first thing I always want you to ask is, do they have a number in common? And then do they have a variable in common? In that order. Okay, so only the first term has a variable. So the variable question isn't even a thing right now for 1 and 2. But they do have a number in common. And 12 and 3 are both divisible by 3. So the greatest common factor is 3. What you do is you factor it out. And the operation that you do while factoring is actually dividing. So we're going to divide 3x by 3. The 3's will go away and leave you with just x. And then we do 12 divided by 3, which is 4. And that is the answer. So it's simple as that. I'm not going to do every example just because I don't think there's a need for every example on here. But just so this video is not as long and you can get through it pretty quickly. If you have further questions, I will do more examples for you. I'll just let me know. Okay. So number 2, the first question is, what number do they have in common? Well, this one's a little bit more straightforward because they both have a 7, but they don't have a variable in common. So the only thing you're going to factor out is the 7. So when you factor out, you're dividing by 7. 7y divided by 7 is just y. And then negative 7 divided by positive 7 is just negative 1. Remember this. A lot of people try to make it 0 and then it goes away. There's 2 terms here. There has to be 2 terms here. All right, on to the next page. Okay, so I'm just going to do all the problems, all these odd problems, and skip the even. If you need the even, just let me know. Okay, I will definitely do them, but I'm just going to do these to keep it short. So again, your first question is always asking, do they have a number in common? And do they have a variable in common? Okay, so on number 3, they're both even. So you could take a 2 out, but 36 and 8 actually have 4 in common. Okay, they're both divisible by 4. This has a variable of m. This has a variable of n. They don't share that in common, 2 different variables. So our only greatest common factor, is 4. So we're going to divide each term by 4. 8 divided by 4 is 2, and we leave the m because there's no variable, and 36 divided by 4 is 9, and we leave the variable. So that is the only greatest common factor. What I'd like for you to do is go ahead and do number 5. I want you to see if you can figure out what the greatest common factor is and then what the answer would be after factoring out that greatest common factor. So we're going to pause the video and then restart it once you figured out where you get stuck. So pause the video now. All right, now that you unpause the video, we need to figure out and go over what the greatest common factor is. This is even, this is odd, so 2 is not an option. But 6 and 27 both have 3 in common. And at most 3. 27 is not divisible by 6, so we have to use factors of 6 that can divide 27. This has a variable, 27 doesn't, so there's no variable in common, so we're only taking out 3, which means dividing. So anytime I say take out, I really just need divide. So 6 divided by 3 is 2. The a squared just drops down because there's no a being divided, and you're left with 9. And that is your final answer. Okay? Now 7 and 9 have 3 terms, and there's no difference, but we just have to remember if there's 3 terms in the beginning, then there has to be 3 terms in the parentheses. If there's 4 terms in the beginning, there has to be 4 terms in the parentheses. If there's 10 terms in the beginning, you have to have 10 terms in the parentheses. So just make sure you follow that. 3 and 3, 2 and 2, 2 and 2, okay? So on this one, we're going to ask ourselves, as always, what is the greatest common factor numerically, okay? This has a 2, this has a 2. They both have a 2 in common, and 4 is divisible by 2. So 2 is our first greatest common factor. The next thing we have to ask is variables, and you're asking what they have at most in common, not what they have most of, but they have in common. So this has 1x, this has 1x, this has 2x's. Since these only have x to the first power, that's all that they have in common. They don't have 2 x's in this. They have 1. This has 2. So they have at most 1 in common. And I realize I did not leave enough space for this, so let me erase this. Okay. So they have an x in common. And then you need to look, they all have a y, so they all have a y in common. This has 2, this has 1, this has 1. So you always have to basically go with the lowest power of what they have in common. So 1 is the lower power, so that is the greatest common factor. So now you're dividing every term by 2xy. Okay, 2 divided by 2 goes away. There's 1x here and 1 here, so you just take 2 minus 1, which is 1, and the y's would go away. Because it'd be technically y to the 0 power, which is 1. So you're left with just x. On the second term, the 2's go away, but they're subtracting, so we have to carry that down. The x's would go away, because there's 1 of each. And then 2 minus 1 would give you y to the first power. So minus y. This is positive, the 2 is positive, so a positive divided by a positive is a positive answer. 4 divided by 2 is 2. The x's go away, the y's go away, and that's our answer. If you notice, there's 3 terms in my parenthesis, and there's 3 terms in the beginning. So that's our final answer. Okay. Last problem. We, again, need to figure out what numerically the first greatest common factor is. So I always like to look at the smaller number. It's kind of your guide, okay? They're all even, so 2 is the greatest common factor. But 8's divisible by 4, 28's divisible by 4, and 16's divisible by 4. So the greatest number that they actually have in common is 4. Now we can't use 8, because even though 8 and 16 are both divisible by 8, 28 isn't. So that factor does not work. The next thing we need to ask is, are there any x's in common? Well, this has 1x, this has 1x, and this has no x's. So since this has no x, they have no x's in common. Okay, even those 2 have 1 of each, this one has nothing. So no x's. But they each have a y in common, and the lowest power of that y is y to the first power. So that's what they have at most in common. So the greatest common factor in the situation is 4y. So we're dividing everything by 4y. 16 divided by 4 is 4. There's no x's to divide, so that just drops down. And this is y squared and y, so we're left with 1y. Okay. Positive 28 divided by positive 4 is positive 7. There's no x on the bottom, so nothing to divide out, and the y's would go away. And then last but not least, you have 8 divided by 4, which is 2, and the y's would go away. So you're left with that. And notice again, there's 3 terms here, and there's 3 terms in the beginning. Okay. 2, 7, and 4 have nothing in common. This only has an x, this has an x, this has no x, no y, no y, and a y. So there's nothing left in here that has a greatest common factor, so we're done with that problem. All right, if you have any further questions, just comment, and I can always record more of this lesson. All right, thanks.